The title of this video is 4 Ways Your Own Mind Blocks You. For your entire life, your mind has been under the control of a complex program that has one mission: your safety and security. This sounds like a really good thing, right? But wait, everything your mind does is rooted in the survival of its identity, and it is in fear of anything that it thinks might threaten it. The mind continually searches for reasons. It lives in emotional pain, frustration, anger, fear, discouragement, guilt, anxiety, depression, and yet it's unable to find an explanation of why it continually ends up suffering over and over. Because the mind is integrated throughout your thinking and feelings, you usually don't realize that it is the cause of sabotaging your success, love, peace, happiness. But how can this possibly be true? Well, the answer lies in the fact that inside of you, there are 4 major components that form your identity. What you are most familiar with is your conscious mind, which of course is linked to your personality. So what you think and feel all day is who you think you are. However, there are 3 other components of who you are that you usually don't think about and probably are not usually aware of. Now, I know you've heard of the subconscious mind. It holds a lot of your memories and beliefs. So that's number 2. But you also have unconscious mental storage, which is a little bit less known. And in that we can include cellular memory, that is, events, especially with emotional content, that impact the very cells of your physical body. There are ancestral memories. There's karma programs, which are stored in what is called the causal body. And you have belief programs, which are held in your chakras and your aura layers. So let's call this the 3rd source of what makes up who you are. Now, in addition, there is your soul, or your higher self, which is very different from the preceding 3 components. So if someone asks who you are, how do you answer that question? Or maybe it would be better to, and more accurate to say, who is answering the question? So for sake of our discussion here, I'm going to skip over the soul for the time being. We'll come back to it later. And I want to focus on your thinking analytical mind first, because that's what is at the surface of your everyday life. To reveal your deep core truth and to understand who and what you are, you've got to start at being open-minded enough to be willing to question and challenge and maybe change your perceptions and beliefs. And it is those perceptions and beliefs that determine your emotions, your reactions, and how you interact with people. So who is it interacting with people? Who are you? Who is answering these questions? Well, you might say, well, I am. But you're composed of more than one component that can respond. And in some cases, one aspect of your identity might even disagree with another part. Did you know that your subconscious mind can have beliefs that are opposite of your conscious mind? I see people arguing all day long, defending their subjective beliefs. So you think that you're being objective, but if you only have very limited information on a topic, how could you really be objective? You form conclusions and beliefs based on input of what you've heard, what you've read, what you've seen. But you don't have all the information on any topic for that matter. So your mind extrapolates. based on all the input you've received from all the different sources. Despite all you think you know, you only know partial factual information. And yet everyone has strong emotions and opinions on every topic they talk about. It takes a great deal of humility to admit you've been wrong with many of your points of view. And this is one of the most difficult shifts in a person's consciousness. However, it is also the only way you're ever going to evolve. Otherwise, you just stay where you are. And everybody thinks they want to evolve, and yet they inherently resist change. So we've got to ask the question, why is it so difficult? Well, to change your opinions, your beliefs, and your outlook shakes the very core of your foundation. It requires you to make a complete reevaluation of what you base your life on. And this is upsetting to the foundation of your safety and security. Admitting you've been wrong is not only difficult, it can be painful because it undermines your safety and stability. It projects uncertainty and it challenges your self-image, your identity, who you think you are, who you believe yourself to be. Your beliefs are the layers in the foundation of your personality. Your desires, your needs, and even what you expect in the afterlife, all of your religious beliefs. Your beliefs form the orientation of how you think and how you treat others. In other words, your beliefs shape your life and they guide all the choices that you make. But listen, admitting your beliefs have been wrong is one of the greatest acts of courage you could ever undertake, because that is what enables you to evolve to the next level of consciousness that's waiting for you. And actually, it's the only way to do it. But most people go through their day completely unaware of all of this. You could say they're asleep, but being asleep in this context is not what you do at night. Being asleep is a mental posture, ignoring or in denial of other information, and especially of higher consciousness perspectives. This requires enough curiosity to spend time in self-examination by asking yourself some questions like, who is it living inside of this? Who is listening? Who is responding? Who is it who argues with other people? Who is it who becomes emotional? Am I fulfilling my purpose? Who is answering these questions? Whoever this is it willing to let go of its most cherished beliefs in order to evolve and discover deeper truths? How awake you are is proportional to how open-minded you are. And if you say you're open-minded, are you willing to question your beliefs? That's the only way you're going to be sure you're evolving. The chances are good that you're on a plateau, maybe in a limbo state, somewhere between truth and illusions, reality and unreality, fact and fiction. This is probably the case because a large portion of what you've been taught since you've been born has been filtered through a whole maze of misinformation and partial truths. You've been unaware of this because you accepted a lot of perspectives as factual from the time you were little. But those conclusions were based on a lot of partial information that was actually processed in a certain way to make them seem plausible and true, to lead you to certain conclusions. And a lot of the people that are providing that information have made themselves available some of the best psychological tools to persuade you to their way of thinking. So your mind works in a way that it thinks it's keeping you safe, but it's actually blocking you and even tricking you. For instance, one example of how this works is when your belief or position is challenged. One reaction that usually happens is you become defensive. In some cases, you may also get angry because you think anger will protect you from being taken advantage of, or mistreated, or deceived. The reason you seem to automatically get angry is your mind believes that it is its job and it is in a position to keep you safe and secure. And it all started when you were a little child. Do you ever remember throwing tantrums when you were little? Most little kids do. So you throw a tantrum over not getting what you wanted. And then if you scream loud enough, long enough, the adults will give you what you want in order to keep your mouth shut. So that as you grow older, you discover that by getting upset and raising your voice, maybe yelling, that will cause other people to submit. And you can see this playing out every day if you watch the news. The activists, the rioters, the crusaders yelling for their causes, not to mention arguments within families. This plays out in everyday life all the time. The problem with this approach is, of course, it doesn't get to the end result that people are hoping that it will. Anger keeps you diverted from healthy solutions because anger breeds more anger and it fuels arguments, and it's ultimately self-defeating and even destructive. The opposite of anger, being calm and peaceful, does elevate you to an experience of life that you do want. Everything responds to peace and love, and that becomes self-replicating as well, self-fulfilling. Being able to respond with positive reactions, peacefulness, calmness, rationality, takes being self-aware of your motivations and why you respond the way you do, and catching yourself before you allow yourself to just have an emotional outburst. If someone challenges your beliefs and criticizes or blames you, you might think it's natural to respond with anger, but that derives from what's called a conditioned mind. So anger is the first way your own mind blocks you and tricks you out of getting what you want. A second way your mind blocks you or tricks you is fear, which paradoxically, by the way, is your most effective self-preservation technique. So fear seems to make sense, right? Because it's designed to keep you far away from anything that might be threatening or might be dangerous. But it can also cause you to make irrational choices or freeze. The freeze response is like a deer in the headlights, where it doesn't know what to do. It doesn't know which way to move. And so the freeze response actually puts you in a greater danger. But when you're confronted with something very threatening, or you have what's called post-traumatic stress disorder, you've been under stress for a long time, your body goes into lockdown. It goes into freeze mode. So your fear response is where stress and anxiety are triggered over circumstances that usually aren't even particularly threatening. But The mind will take something that it perceives could be, and it extrapolates and exaggerates what it imagines could happen. Fears are always about the unknown, and they're always about the future. And therefore, they're not currently real. They're not even happening now. The fear response is attempting to keep you safe, but it usually also prevents you from moving forward or evolving or making healthy choices. And yet, fear is the primary operating system of the mind. What most people don't know is an emotionally controlled mind can be replaced by integrating your soul into the fear or the anger or any other negative program for that matter. In fact, merging the soul into the negative programming is ultimately the only solution. And that's why I titled my first book, The Soul Solution. And that book has a lot more about fear and what to do about it. So I'm not going to elaborate any more about it here. But there's a big truth here about human emotion. And it was completely missed by Mr. Spock and the Vulcans in the Star Trek universe. They never figured this out. Their approach was to use willpower to suppress all emotions. And that often failed or led to conflict. There's a much happier solution, and actually a much easier solution, that leads to a much happier outcome. Among the mind's many irrational conclusions, one of the most common is the third way your mind blocks you or tricks you: the belief that pain leads to success and fulfillment. And here's how it works. Often, when a person is on a spiritual path, they believe they are being presented with trials and tribulations designed by God to perfect their character so they can evolve spiritually. They may be challenged so severely, they speak of suffering a dark night of the soul. So sometimes those circumstances can lead to an awakening, but more often they lead to confusion and discouragement and ongoing suffering, which keeps the person spiritually asleep. Some people even become invested in their stories of what they think of as righteous suffering. So they enjoy talking about it. Why? Because they feel the suffering is evidence they're spiritually evolving. However, once again, that is the mind trying to figure out why it is in pain and finding some way to justify the pain it experiences. The truth is, you do not need to suffer pain or loss or lack in order to evolve spiritually. As a matter of fact, the opposite is true. Anything negative, anything painful, are simply indications of the mind's programs shouting at you, I have a problem. Will you please heal me, clear me of this? Address the cause. So your ego-controlled mind is constantly analyzing and concluding what causes pain and suffering. And it often projects blame onto itself or others to explain why it suffers. The ego-controlled mind is a searching mechanism. It is forever trying to find answers. And in the process, it forms erroneous conclusions, such as it thinks it needs more things to feel secure. It needs more people to love them to feel secure and to feel worthwhile. It needs a different physical appearance to be confident. It needs others to like it to feel self-acceptance. It needs more success to feel safe and secure and fulfilled. You see, the ego has a dilemma here. It does not even know why it suffers. In some cases, it criticizes and blames itself for being imperfect and bad, and it concludes that must be why I'm suffering. So it'll project blame on other people. And if you blame others, that causes the ego mind to feel exonerated and validated. So the ego feels a little better about itself, at least for a while. Breaking through this ego block requires that you recognize your role is in helping to create, attract, and sustain the very conditions that you want to be free from. This is not an easy pill to swallow. It requires a very high degree of honesty with yourself, including admitting you're part of the creation of the experience. It also means you are responsible for your interpretations, conclusions, and beliefs, all about your life. It also means that the degree of happiness you feel, the spiritual realizations you have, and your responses to life all emanate from within. The reality is, nothing outside of you can give you what you don't give to yourself internally. I'm going to repeat that. The reality is, nothing outside of you can give you what you don't give yourself internally. The ego mind harbors a mistaken belief that suffering and struggling are important parts of a spiritual path. The more you suffer, the more that's evidence that you are spiritual. Somehow, the ego has concluded that pain, struggle, and suffering are all payment for its sins and defects. Therefore, the more pain, the more progress. It struggles to try to come up with an explanation of why it suffers. Why it suffers pain, why it suffers loss, why it suffers lack. So this is the basis for the belief that a sacrifice is needed to pay for or atone for doing something bad or wrong. And you find this myth throughout many of the world's religions. But it's actually an ego-based concept that's created in an attempt, a vain attempt, to explain suffering, pain, and loss. You see, the mind concludes it must have done something bad to result in the pain and loss. So, in order to prevent further pain and loss, you can offer a sacrifice of some sort. So, you can interpret that however you want, because each religion does it a little bit differently. But it requires that you offer something to appease the gods or whatever rule or law you felt like you violated. Requires a consequence. It requires payment, and payment is in the form of pain. So that's at least the way the ego mind concludes it. So you can learn from struggles, there's no question about that. But they're certainly not prerequisites to spiritual evolution. And in fact, the true spiritual path leads to relief from pain and suffering. So isn't that kind of the opposite of what you normally hear? But this doesn't stop the ego mind from believing that being martyred for its beliefs is a high spiritual calling. To think that suffering, loss, or pain is a foundation for a high spiritual realization is an ego mind block. Suffering can certainly make you think you are progressing by making you think God is testing you or refining you. This is a common belief in many religions. Of course, suffering can help you awaken spiritually, but it's certainly not a prerequisite, nor is it a very evolved approach to your spiritual evolution. It's an ego-mind distortion of spiritual evolution. You do not need to suffer to experience the soul or to awaken spiritually. By now, you can realize that the insanity of living with these motivations. And yet, these are the primary ways the ego-controlled mind operates. When you integrate the soul into your mind, all of this irrationality goes away. The soul automatically brings peace, security, happiness, fulfillment, healing, contentment, and even joyfulness. And that is why I named my first book, The Soul Solution. It's a play on words. A fourth block that your mind often creates is the belief that spiritual practices lead to happiness and fulfilling your purpose. So I need to preface this by saying there's certainly nothing wrong with spiritual practices, and they're often helpful. I've done many of them myself. But if they become an end within themselves, then they're defeating a purpose. So what do I mean by spiritual practices? Well, you may find yourself dedicated to particular types of ceremonies or pujas or postures or mantras or mudras or traditions which can become traps keeping you where you are rather than facilitating your evolution. Defining what a spiritual person is usually has certain images that it brings up. So if I ask you, what is on your mind when you think of a person who's spiritual? Well, you might think of monks or priests or nuns, or maybe shamans or yogis, and different kinds of gurus wearing different kinds of costumes. If you're oriented around New Age ideas, you might also say, well, they might have something to do with crystals or burning incense and reading tarot cards and doing chakra balancing practices or chanting or ascension meditations or some kind of psychic readings. And those are all outer forms based on what groups and individuals have decided to find spirituality. All the spiritual practices make you feel like you're doing something on the right spiritual path, and breakthroughs are getting close. But in many cases, people end up chasing an elusive goal. The reality is that what you are seeking is already within you. It's your soul. The challenge comes from the ego-controlled mind, which has no clue on how to make a connection with your soul. You see, the soul is below many mind-created layers of beliefs and needs and desires and wants and conclusions and conditioning and all your accumulated history from your entire past. And while all of these spiritual practices can be beneficial, they are not what make you spiritual. So the problem with this one is that the ego thinks being spiritual is something that's related to what you do externally. Actually, the ego doesn't know what spirituality is. How could it? The ego mind operates only through the senses. And true spirituality is a matter of consciousness realization beyond the mind or beyond the senses. So because this is the only thing the ego can do, is speculate about spirituality, that's what it does. It uses knowledge and the intellect to gather definitions and methods and practices. It wants to accumulate more information, more payment that it is doing the right thing. There are lots of spiritual scholars who have vast funds of knowledge. They spend their whole lifetime studying ancient texts, studying the words of spiritual masters and teachers. And some, of course, do have spiritual realization. But in a lot of cases, the mistake that's often made is knowledge for spiritual realizations. You, of course, need a certain baseline of knowledge. That's part of our spiritual evolutionary process, but it's not the same thing. What this premise does is motivate and even reward a person for gaining information on spiritual and religious topics. The ego will assist a person to keep pursuing more knowledge, more techniques, more practices, more initiations, and maybe more certificates, more degrees, more diplomas, more recognition. As long as you're doing something along these lines, the external form, the ego mistakenly believes you're evolving spiritually. As you evolve your consciousness, your next level of awakening will never be what you think it will be, because the ego-controlled mind has no idea what spirituality is. So it speculates. It formulates beliefs and conclusions based on what it has read, what it's heard, what it's participated in, what it's seen, what other people have said. And all of that arises from the world of the senses. Spiritual evolution is a matter of consciousness and awareness, not the realm of thinking, analyzing, or calculating, or speculating, or reasoning. Your mission in this life is to evolve your consciousness to a sustained, unconditional love. That's it. That's what the soul is made out of. The soul is made out of unconditional love. And that is why all the spiritual paths say that love is the way. So it is the way along the path, and it is also the destination. To fully internalize and realize the deepest, most profound levels of love. Everything else is what your mind makes up. And the way you do this is by meditative attention on your heart center, holding your attention on merging with your soul, which is love, and higher source presence. And the great thing is, you don't need to go anywhere. You don't need to travel somewhere. You can do it right now. This is the solution that is right with you. It's as close to as your breath and your heartbeat, because it's your own soul. Your soul has always been with you, waiting patiently for you to call it, wanting to integrate into your everyday experiences, to discover what it is that you've been searching for all along. It's right there. Nothing external can give you the answers and solutions. Your life journey is a process of discovering what already lives within you. What appears to be your evolution is actually peeling away all of the conclusions, the projections, all the layers the ego-controlled mind has laid down. And what is revealed is the underlying truth. It's been present with you the entire time throughout your history. And in fact, the soul is often called the true self. So discovering the true self, the soul, is the uncovering of what you are and your path, and it is what leads to your spiritual evolution. Pursuing anything externally can be fun, but it could also be a major diversion from what you really want to be doing to serve your spiritual evolution. Anything invested in what is external ends up feeding and strengthening ego needs and wants. All the external pursuits are like trying to grasp a carrot at the end of a stick. No matter how delicious it looks, you never quite are able to reach it. And you end up being discouraged, dissatisfied, disillusioned. Even while you find yourself thinking you're close. I just feel like there's a shift coming right around the corner next weekend when there's an alignment. So you think you're close, you feel like you're close, and you might be. But if you are, it is because you're making connection with the soul. Not because you're gathering more knowledge, not because you're doing more spiritual practices. You're ever pursuing, but never quite reaching the breakthroughs that you hope through any spiritual practice that is external. It's all done through turning within. And eventually, all the outer seeking will give way to the realization of what is being sought is already present within you. And you can access it starting right now. And the process is also very simple. Religion sometimes complicates these things. They make it complicated, that you have to do it a certain way, you have to follow certain formulas, you have to say the right words the right way. When all you have to do is, through meditation, make deep inner connections with the underlying truth of your soul. And your soul is called your true self, because all the other things you thought you are mind games. They actually shield you from your true self. The way to make deep soul connections is to close your eyes, call to your soul, and ask it to emerge in your heart. This is the exact way I did it many years ago, when I had no idea how. But I trusted that there must be an aspect of me that is able to be connected to God, or to the source of all, to the Creator. And what I found is, as you continually call to the soul, you will eventually notice that your energy starts shifting, and the soul begins to emerge. And as it does, you begin to notice there are sensations. There's a feeling of an embrace of love, of comfort, of peace. In fact, if you look at the word for the Holy Spirit in the New Testament of the Bible, it's parakletos, which means comforter. And it's really connecting with the soul, which is an aspect of God, which is a spiritual aspect of what we are. And as you call to it, it has intelligence in it, and it enables you to make a personal connection with God, with your own soul. The exact formulas that I used, I put in an audio program that I titled Soul Merge. In other words, merging every aspect of who and what you think you are with the soul. And when I say soul, I mean the highest enlightened aspect of the soul, which is really God. And you'll find that program on my website if you're interested in it. But you can start right now. You can do it yourself. Put a hand over the center of your chest and start repeating, I feel my soul in my heart. Now, when you first start doing that, you may not feel anything. What I suggest you do is repeat it every 30 seconds, mouthing the words, moving your lips as you say the words. Do it for a minimum of 20 minutes a day. You may not notice anything for weeks. I did not either. However, I kept doing it. And there was one day when it did happen. And I remember I felt almost like God was hugging me, or a most beautiful, loving angel was wrapping its wings around me. There's a very deep, comforting, healing feeling that came with it. I kept doing it, so that's what I suggest you do, because through it you discover what the Christ consciousness is. You discover what enlightenment is. You discover what ascension is. And it's what enables you to become enlightened and to ascend. So if you are as determined as I was, and as I still am, I know it will work for you. It absolutely has to. You're just calling to your own soul. If there's anything in existence that you can trust, it's your own soul, which interfaces directly with divine. Now, that level of breakthrough does require dedication, determination, and devotion. You must be committed to connecting with your soul until you have the breakthroughs. If you persist, you will. It may take time, over weeks, maybe even over months. Everybody's different. but you will be rewarded. And the rewards are worth all the inconveniences needed to obtain them. Promise yourself that you will practice every day, calling to the soul, calling to the God source, and asking it to emerge and engulf you, to embrace you, to support you, to inspire you. Keep working on it, and I'll see you in my next video.